Alright, welcome to the first of the domain review videos. We're going to be going through the major concepts, terms, and topics in Domain 1, Security and Risk Management. We're going to start with the most critical concept of how we align the security function with the overall goals and objectives of the business. And then we're going to start talking briefly about intellectual property, business continuity management, and, very importantly, risk management. So let's start with how we align the security function to the overall business strategy and the overall goals and objectives of the business. Now, to do that, we have to first understand what is corporate governance. So corporate governance is the system of rules, practices, and processes through which an organization is directed and controlled. The corporate governance process defines the overall goals and objectives of the organization. Now, based on those goals and objectives, we then think about security governance. And so security governance is the system of rules, practices, and processes by which the security function is controlled. And most importantly, how the security function ensures it is aligned with the organizational goals and objectives, thus ensuring that the security function is an enabler for the business. So let's first think about what's the focus of security. What should security be most focused on? And the focus of security is to enable the business to achieve its goals and objectives, essentially for security to be an enabler to the business. And so the two main goals, or the two things that security should focus on most is how can it enable the business, and if security is able to effectively enable the business, then the business can create more value for its shareholders and increase the overall value of the organization. Now, an important component of security governance is the need to have clearly defined roles and responsibilities. And this is because for security to be effective, it is imperative that individual roles, responsibilities, and authority are clearly communicated and understood by all. Individuals from across the organization must be invested and committed to security. There must be the right tone from the top. So let's define some of the key terms within roles and responsibilities. And the first is accountability. So accountability means having the ultimate ownership, answerability, blameworthiness, and liability. Essentially, it's where the buck stops, or the crude way of putting it, it's the throat that gets choked if something goes wrong. And so ideally, there should only be one entity that is accountable for a particular business function, process, or system. And accountability cannot be delegated. Responsibility is the person or people in charge of a task or an event. They are the doers, developing plans, making things happen, based on the direction of the accountable individual or entity. And there can be multiple people responsible, and responsibility can be delegated, unlike accountability. Due care, it's the responsible protection of assets based on the goals and objectives of the organization. Due diligence is being able to prove it, being able to prove due care to the people that care. And who cares? Upper management, regulators, customers, shareholders, those sorts of folks. Another more minor concept that we talked about in this section was import and export controls. And there are numerous security and privacy related laws and regulations around the world that vary from country to country. And many of these laws often restrict the transfer of cryptographic systems, like cryptographic algorithms, beyond national borders, and also the export or the transfer of data beyond national borders. Related to these import-export controls, an important thing to remember is what's known as the Wassenaar Arrangement. Now, this Wassenaar Arrangement is an agreement between 41 signing members that basically states that any of those signing members can exchange cryptography of any strength with any of the other 41 signing members. So it basically means that any country that is a signing member of the Wassenaar Agreement can use cryptography of any strength with anyone else. We also talked about this concept of trans-border data flows, and this is primarily related to personal information or personally identifiable information. And it's the idea that organizations must be very thoughtful and must consider the laws and regulations out there that restrict the transfer of personal data be outside of national borders. And the perfect example of this is, of course, the European Union GDPR laws, which restrict transferring or storing or using personal information related to EU citizens outside of the EU. We also talked about privacy. And the perfect definition of privacy that you should remember, it's the state or condition of being free from being observed or disturbed by other people. Ethics. The basis of ethics is do nothing that is harmful to anyone else. Now, organizations want consistent ethics, and this can be very difficult to achieve, as our individual ethics can vary quite significantly from person to person, depending on how we've been raised and what our parents may have believed. Organizations want to achieve consistent ethics, and the way that they do this, given the varying ethics from individual to individual, is to codify the ethics in corporate laws, or in other words, codify those ethics in policies. Now, you should remember the CISSP Code of Ethics canons, the wording of each of the 4 canons and the order in which they go. So those 4 canons are: number 1, protect society, the common good, necessary public trust and confidence, and the infrastructure. Number 2, act honorably, honestly, justly, responsibly, and legally. Number 3, provide diligent and competent service to principals. And number 4, advance and protect the profession. Now let's talk about these corporate laws, or, and a better name for them, policies. Because policies, in essence, are corporate laws. Policies are things that employees must or shall do. And policies document and communicate management's goals and objectives. They provide authority to the security's function. They define the elements, functions, the scope of the security team. Now, most organizations will start with one overarching security policy. This policy comes from upper management. It defines the corporate goals and objectives, and therefore drives the creation of all the underlying functional policies. Now, the functional policies are high-level policies that tell us what to do in order to meet those specific goals and objectives in different areas. Things like acceptable use policies and backup policies and anti-malware policies, as an example. Those functional policies then drive the next components: standards, procedures, baselines, and guidelines. And here's the definition of each. So standards are specific requirements, for example, hardware or software mechanisms or products. Procedures are step-by-step required actions or instructions in order to implement a policy. Baselines are minimum levels of security requirements. And finally, guidelines are suggestions. They're things that are good to do, but not necessarily required. They're optional, and they're the only thing on this list that are optional. Everything else, policies, standards, procedures, and baselines, are mandatory. Now, another huge part of overall security governance is risk management. But it's such a big topic, we're going to leave it for a slide on its own, which we're going to talk about next. So I'm going to skip over risk management for now and talk about procurement. And so procurement is the process through which organizations acquire new hardware, software, other companies, services, etc. And a big part of procurement is the creation of SLAs as part of procuring services. And so let's talk briefly about contracts and SLAs, service level agreements. Contracts and SLAs are particularly important when the organization procures services, as the contract defines the overall legal terms, such as payments, termination terms, etc. The SLA, on the other hand, the service level agreement, describes the service, documents service targets, specific responsibilities, that sort of thing. And the SLA is a subcomponent, an addendum to the contract. And the final thing we talked about on the slide is training, awareness, and education. Now, we talked about this concept that security is everyone's responsibility. However, for that to be true, people have to know what they're supposed to do. And awareness, training, and education is how we teach people so they understand their responsibilities and they can therefore make it their responsibility. The goal of awareness is to change cultural sensitivity to a given topic or issue. Training provides specific skills necessary to perform something related to security. And finally, education provides the understanding of fundamental concepts, which therefore gives an individual decision-making capability. And so that's training, education, and awareness. Okay, now let's look at risk management. And risk management consists of three major components. The first of which is asset valuation. Now, asset valuation is the process through which the organization identifies tangible or intangible assets and sorts them from greatest value to the organization to least value. Sorting these assets can be done in one of either of two methods, quantitative or qualitative analysis. Quantitative analysis means using numbers, and very specific numbers, monetary numbers like Canadian pesos. Qualitative, on the other hand, is a relative ranking system, using words like high, medium, or low to rank assets relative to each other. So this asset is more value, it's of higher value than, say, this asset. Now, once we have identified the most valuable assets to the organization and ranked them, we can then begin the next step of risk management, which is risk analysis. And it's through this process that we identify all of the risks related to an asset and rank those risks from, again, most important to the organization to least. Now, the first thing that we look at as part of risk analysis is the threats. Now, what is the definition of a threat? The perfect definition of a threat is it's any potential danger to the organization. And that can be natural threats like hurricanes and floods, technical threats like systems going offline or viruses, malware. It could be physical threats like the power going out or lack of cooling, as an example. And it could even be people. You could have malicious insiders, you could have riots outside your office. So those are any potential dangers. We then talked about two major methods that we could use to identify threats in a very systematic way. And those two methodologies are STRIDE and PASTA. STRIDE identifies threats by thinking through major categories based on the name STRIDE. So the first is spoofing of user identity. Next is tampering, repudiation, information disclosure, denial of service, and elevation of privileges. So going through those 6 categories will help someone systematically identify all the potential threats associated to an asset. PASTA is a 7-step risk-centric methodology. It starts by identifying business objectives and technical requirements and takes into account compliance issues and business-specific risks. And the important word here is it's a risk-based or a risk-centric methodology. And the way it does this is PASTA sort of goes through a sort of 7-step process, and it provides an attacker-centric view which the defenders can then use to develop the list of potential threats. So remember those two, STRIDE and PASTA. And remember in particular that of the two, PASTA is much better at taking this risk-centric view. Now, once we have identified the threats, we then want to think about the vulnerabilities. And a vulnerability is defined as a weakness that exists. So some weakness that exists in a system, an unpatched system, the lack of a backup power system, the lack of a fire suppression system, the lack of high enough fencing around the facility. Any of these would be a vulnerability, a weakness that exists. A couple of methods that we can use to identify vulnerabilities are vulnerability assessment and pen testing. And we're going to talk about both of these methods later on in Domain 6. The next piece that we look at in risk analysis is likelihood. And likelihood is simply the degree of exposure or the chance that something might happen. How likely is this risk to occur? Next, we look at impact. And impact is the negative consequence that will occur to the organization if the risk is realized. That impact could be anything from a loss of confidentiality, integrity, or availability. It could be financial, could be reputational, non-compliance with laws and regulations. It could be a privacy-related risk. It could be loss of life. It could be any of these things. Anything that negatively impacts the organization is an impact. Similar to asset evaluation, within risk analysis, there's two major methods that we can use to rank the risks from most severe to least severe. And those methods are quantitative and qualitative. Quantitative is, of course, using monetary values. And so there's one major formula that you need to know about in order to quantify or come up with how much a risk could cost the organization in a year. And that is the ALE calculation, the annualized loss expectancy. And ultimately, this formula is used to calculate the total cost an organization can expect to occur from a given risk in a year. To determine the ALE, you need to first determine the SLE, which is the single loss expectancy. To determine the SLE, you must multiply the asset value times the exposure factor. The asset value is simply the value of the asset in dollars and cents. Exposure factor is the percentage of the asset that will be lost if the risk is realized. You multiply those two numbers together, the asset value times the exposure factor, and that gives you your single loss expectancy, your SLE. You then have to determine your ARO, your annualized rate of occurrence, which is how often you expect the risk to occur per year. So if we determine that the risk will occur once per year, then the ARO is 1. If we determine that the risk is going to occur twice a year, ARO would be 2. And if we figure out that the risk is going to occur, say, every 2 years, then the ARO would be 0.5. Once you have the single loss expectancy and the ARO, you multiply those two numbers together, and that gives you your annualized loss expectancy. And of course, the other method we can use is qualitative, which again is a relative ranking system. Now, once we've completed the risk analysis process, we now have all of our assets and all of the risks associated with those most valuable assets. We can now begin the third step of risk management, which is treatment. There are 4 major ways that we can treat a risk. We can avoid, transfer, mitigate, and accept. And let's start with avoid. Avoid is often the safest option. It simply means that you avoid whatever the risky thing is. So if moving to the cloud, for instance, is super risky, the way you avoid that risk is to not move to the cloud. The next treatment method is to transfer the risk. And you should essentially associate transfer with buying insurance. Now, the next one, where we're going to spend the majority of our time and where most of the risk treatment is going to occur, is mitigation. And mitigation means implementing cost-justified controls to reduce the risk. Now, there's a bunch of different ways that we can look at this. And let's start by first looking at the different categories of controls. And the first category is administrative. And administrative means any of the controls that are things like policies, procedures, processes, standards, guidelines, training, awareness. Anything that is sort of an administrative type process would be falling under administrative. Technical or logical is another category of controls. And technical or logical are all the controls which provide logical security, like access control systems, firewalls, security information and event management systems, IDS or IPS. Any of these are logical controls. And remember, if you get a question asking you the difference between technical and logical, the difference is this. Technical is the actual hardware that makes up a system. So let's take a firewall as an example. A firewall is made up of both the hardware and the software. And so the technical part is the hardware. The logical part is the software. The third category is physical controls. And physical controls are controls which provide physical security in some sort of way. Locks, cameras, man traps, that sort of thing. So those are 3 ways that we can categorize controls. Another 2 ways that we can categorize controls is the difference between safeguards and countermeasures. Now, safeguards are controls which are proactive or preventative in nature, controls which attempt to prevent a risk from occurring. And examples of safeguards are things like directive controls, deterrence controls, and preventative controls. And let's define each of those. So directive controls are controls which direct behavior. And the way that we direct behavior within an organization is policies. So directive controls are essentially policies which direct behavior. Deterrent controls attempt to discourage some sort of behavior through signage, warnings, banners, things like that. And preventative controls are those types of controls which actually somehow try and prevent a risk from being realized by having a fire suppression system, by implementing an access control mechanism that prevents someone from logging in, an unauthorized person from logging into the system. So these are all examples of safeguards controls. And the other major category is countermeasures. And countermeasures are controls which are reactive, controls which are put in place when a risk has occurred. And the controls within countermeasures, the first is, of course, detective. We need to be able to detect that a risk has occurred in order to then do the following steps. The first of which is corrective. Corrective controls try and mitigate or minimize the damage of the risk having occurred. We then move to recovery. And recovery controls attempt to restore the business, the operations to normal. And the final one, which doesn't really fit in any of these categories, is known as a compensating control. And a compensating control basically makes up for the lack of another control somewhere else. Perfect example of this is user manager supervision. Now, the final thing that we looked at related to controls is this concept of functional versus assurance. So what does functional mean? Well, functional is, what is the control meant to do? If the control is a firewall, what is a firewall meant to do? It's designed to control the flow of traffic between network segments. So that's the function of a firewall. The functional aspect of the control is what it's meant to do. Assurance, on the other hand, is how do we actually ensure that the control is working effectively? And typically the way that we get assurance that the control is working correctly is through logging, monitoring, or some other testing of the control. Now, the fourth and final way that we can treat risk is accept the risk. And this is actually a really important thing to do because there is always a degree of residual risk. For instance, when we're implementing mitigating controls, we can never implement the perfect mitigating controls that are going to reduce the risk to 0. So there is always a degree of what we call residual risk, and that residual risk has to be accepted. Or another case where we might use risk acceptance is the cost of the control might be more than the cost of the risk being realized to the organization, in which case the best risk treatment is then to accept the risk. In either of these scenarios, who is best positioned to accept the risk? The owner, because they best understand the impact of the risk to the organization and can best understand the costs, etc. So that's risk management. As the final part of Domain 1, let's look at intellectual property laws and business continuity management. And we'll start with intellectual property. There are 4 major intellectual property concepts that you need to know about. The first is trade secrets. So what are trade secrets? Well, they are meant to protect some important business information, like the formula for Coke. Trade secrets do not need to be disclosed, and the term of protection, how long they can last for, is potentially infinite. Patents are meant to protect some innovative or novel idea. They do need to be disclosed, and they only provide protection for a set period of time. Copyright protects the expression of an idea in some sort of fixed medium, like books, movies, or songs. Disclosure is required, and the protection is again only for a set period of time. And finally, trademarks protect some sort of unique color, sound, symbol used to distinguish one product or company from another. Perfect example is the Nike swoosh. Disclosure is again, of course, required, and the terms of protection are potentially infinite for trademarks. So those are the four major trade intellectual property concepts that you need to be aware of. Now let's talk about business continuity management. And what's the focus of business continuity management? It's not on all systems or processes. Rather, the focus is on the most critical or essential systems and processes. The first step in business continuity management is the business impact assessment process. This is the process which is used to determine those most critical systems or processes within the business, and then determine 4 very important measurements of time: the RPO, RTO, WRT, and MTD. So let's go through each of those measurements of time. And we'll start with the RPO. This is your recovery point objective. And it's essentially the maximum tolerable data loss that an organization can accept. RPO might be an organization is only willing to accept an hour's worth of data loss, or a minute's worth of data loss, or a second's worth of data loss. The next measurement is the RTO, which is the recovery time objective. And this is essentially the time from when the incident occurs to the point at which the business is back at some sort of defined service level. So it's the recovery time to a defined service level. A good example of this, of the RTO, would be to think of a data center. If there was a failure at the primary data center, the RTO would be a measurement of how long does it take to get back up and running in the backup data center to a defined service level. The next number is the WRT, the work recovery time. And this is the maximum time required to verify the integrity of the systems and data as they return to normal operation. So the way to think about this is, how long does it take to get from your backup data center all the way back to your primary data center again? So this is a measurement of how long does it take you to rebuild, for instance, your primary data center, and then transfer all of those systems back to that primary site. And then the most important measurement out of all of these is what's known as the maximum tolerable downtime, the MTD. And this is the maximum amount of time in total that a process can be disrupted before the business is no longer in business. And so the MTD is a really important measurement. It's what we use to determine, for instance, when we need to activate our disaster recovery plan and treat something not as an incident, but rather as a disaster. Now, we use these different measurements of time, the RPO, RTO, WRT, and MTD, to help us define 2 different major types of plans. The first are business continuity plans, or BCPs. BCPs focus on the survival of the business or some critical business function. Disaster recovery plans focus on the recovery of some vital technological infrastructure or system. And so it's quite common, for instance, that a BCP would contain multiple, or it would be made up of multiple DRPs. But a business continuity plan goes beyond just containing, say, a number of DRP plans. Business continuity plans look to make sure that the overall business function or process keeps running when disaster is occurring. And so the best way I like to think about this is, say that there's been a major disaster with the payroll system. There would be a DRP plan to recover the payroll system. The BCP plan would consider, how do we make sure that people keep getting paid, our employees keep getting paid, while that disaster recovery plan gets the system back online. And so imagine a scenario where the DRP plan said it's going to take 8 weeks to get the payroll system back up and running. A lot of employees would probably be a lot less enthusiastic about showing up for work if they weren't getting paid for 8 weeks. So the BCP plan would consider painful but manual processes like having a stack of blank checks and filling in and mailing those checks for a couple of pay periods well, the disaster recovery plan was focused on getting the payroll system back up and running. So there you go. That's the major components of Domain 1. See you in the next video.